And who better to be our first guest than Andy Serling of the New York Racing Association. Good evening.
How you guys doing tonight?
Andy, good. And this is a fun topic, and it's the topic that our night school audience asked for. And then, of course, if we're going to talk about it, we've got to talk about it with you, who has contributed so much to the evolution of the on-air personality and analyst, and then the offerings that NYRA.com has developed under your direction, Trips and Traps, the National Racing Report. Talk about the position and the responsibility and the approach from your perspective.
Well, I think, honestly, you want to try to make things fun. At the end of the day, this is, while we take it very seriously to a great degree, it's also entertainment for people, and I think you want to make it fun. And so at the end of the day, I think if, we can walk away and say we help people lose a little bit less, then that's a good thing, So from that perspective, I feel the responsibility is to educate but entertain and try to offer things to people that just aren't readily apparent. You don't want to take a lot for granted, but most people understand why a favorite's a heavy favorite. And so I think when you deal with a race, you want to know what the questions are. It's easy to think you have answers in this game, and most of our answers are wrong, and occasionally they're right. But I think to get to the answers, you've got to know what the right questions are. So for us, we try to focus on figuring out what the questions are and hope that our answers are occasionally right.
And the piece of that puzzle that you mentioned, and Caden Bradar talked about it earlier too, and Jeremy as well, identifying areas that may not be readily apparent, and whether it's race conditions and how a horse may be basically running in a condition, Andy, that it's already cleared, under the certain circumstances, things like that the more casual player may not grasp immediately out of the PPs. Other subtleties that you've taught me, the turnbacks and.
Well, you want to get to subtleties, but I think you want to try to figure out what the theme of a race is. And I think that's the first thing we try to get to before we go on the air, and Jason and I talk about. In other words, where do you start? I mean, yeah, some races will have multiple themes, but in general, the race, whether it goes through a certain horse or there's a theme to it, where the theme is, there's a lot of speed in here, so I'm looking for closers. You want to keep it a more central, relatively simple concept, because the truth is I think that a lot of people overcomplicate things. It's a very complicated game on one hand, but a lot of what's going on in racing is common sense. It's in and of itself, it's not that complicated. It's like, I like a closer in here because I think that there are three horses that need the lead and something's got to give. And when I look at their pace figures, they're reasonably close. So therefore it seems reasonable to expect that at least two of them are going to get involved and the other one can't rate anyway. So therefore I want a closer. This is not, this isn't some sort of brilliance. And I think a lot of it, I think people tend to overcomplicate it, and in doing so, they miss some of the stuff that's fairly simple sometimes. And that's what we try to do, is break it down to what's simple and then get into the more complex stuff if need be.
In terms of the race day, and this came up already in some of the questions on the chat applet, and I referenced something that I knew would come up with you, because there is a formal approach to the day at NYRA, and that is talking horses to introduce the entire card and get kind of an overview, and then the pre-race conversation, the prattle that goes on 10 minutes out. And there, the nuances as the day is evolving, as well as your absolutely invaluable board insights. Talk about the importance of the introduction to the day and then adjusting as the day goes on.
Well, think about the whole day as a long conversation, but an evolving conversation. And what we're trying to do, and what we are doing if, in fact, we're successful, is we're generating conversation. We want to talk about the races in such a way that people respond by having their own conversations, whether with themselves or with the TV screen or with their friends. or on the internet or wherever. And the internet's offered an opportunity for people to communicate while not being together or being at the track, and that's one of the really good things about it. But, we're trying to start a conversation. If that conversation goes, I can't stand Serling and I don't want to hear what he has to say, that's great. That's just as good as anything, because that means they're listening or, and they're finding a different way to approach the race. It's all part of a conversation. So, you started on Talking Horses by giving a sort of overview of the race and where you could go, where you might go, who you don't like, who you do like, what the possible scenarios are, and that's something I do with Jason and also with Mike Beer quite a bit. And we talk about, what are the merits of this horse? Is there a long shot in here I'd look at? Do I just think this is a simple situation of I'm not trying to beat the favorite? And keep in mind, when I'm picking short-priced horses, what I'm really saying is I'm not betting this race. Or I may say I'm going to make a cold exacta. I'm using the race in a multi-race bet, but I'm not going to give out a horse just because I don't want to pick the favorite. I'm going to give out a horse as an alternative favorite if, in fact, I am betting that horse. If I'm not betting against the favorite, I'm not going to tell other people to do so. But forgetting about that, and then the day starts evolving and things change because the odds change. Maybe, you take a day like Saturday where you had no reason to believe you're going to have this strong rail, and suddenly you find a situation where you have a big inside speed track. Well, no horse player can be held to their opinions before they knew there was a strong bias affecting the races. And, holding public handicappers to these opinions, that's for the haters. And if they want to do that, that's fine. But in general, you have to adapt. So you use the pre-race prattles as an opportunity to adapt and to talk about odds and where you might go if these odds stayed, or how it's changed your play and how the track's changed it. And, there's a horse I wasn't originally going to talk about, but now we have to talk about. So it's an evolving conversation, and we're trying to keep the conversation both going and going forward.
Jeremy.
Andy, you talked about the haters that are out there, and they line up, and you're a bit of a lightning rod in that you have an opinion and you're not afraid to say it. I'll say that the first time I met you several years ago at the Preakness, I was expecting this guy who was going to be gruff about everything, but it turns out that you're really a nice guy down deep, and I don't think people know that about you. I think it's one of those things that you get a persona on television of having an opinion, and the haters kind of line up and want to take shots. Do you see that as a situation that the internet has kind of inflamed that a little bit, or is it a good thing to have those open lines of communication?
It's both. It's a double-edged sword, Jeremy, because, listen, it's lousy to read people sort of beating up on you. I'll be honest. And I think it's human nature that we take a criticism 10 times as hard as we enjoy a compliment. And I think that's something we all have to deal with in our psyches. But on the other hand, it's better to have that kind of exchange out there because it keeps people talking about the game. And anything that's keeping that conversation going is a good thing. I don't worry about that. To me, I grew up in Saratoga, and my friends were horse players. And when I spent a lot of time with my friend John sitting around, we'd go to the harness track, and we'd be playing the next day at, Ackland or Belmont, and we'd have the form or the program for the harness track and be arguing about the races. We were both strongly opinionated guys, and he and his brother and me and other friends, and we argued about the races, and we had different opinions, and they ran the races, and somebody hopefully was right, and most of us were wrong, and we continue with the argument. And so why should it be different when I'm doing this job on the air? It's just a continued discussion and an argument about the races with different opinions. And, yeah, I believe strongly in my opinion, while knowing that I'm wrong quite often. If that offends other people, I'm sorry, but I'm just trying to, keep it going. And I think, it's better to be hated than to have them not listen to you. And I think if you're going to be on TV or radio, you better hope people are listening.
The old basketball coach Billy Tubbs was a friend of mine back when I was an undergrad, and he used to tell me, I don't care what people write about me as long as they're writing about me. Right. So there's something to be said for that. Andy, you talked a few minutes ago about how track conditions and an overwhelming bias. I know the other day you were talking about you had to be out in the middle of the racetrack and to have any success. How much do you allow that to pull you off of your original thoughts, and at what point do you do that? Identifying a bias is difficult for me personally, and I know for a lot of fans out there. How many races or how many days do you have to kind of see something before it starts to draw you away from what you see on paper?
Well, that's actually a great question, and I don't think I have an absolute answer. In general, I find we deal with even tracks most of the time. With all the rain we've been getting and the conditions, it's been very tough in the main track. We've had a lot of dead rails or bad insides or different biases, and then it's dried out. We've had a gold rail. So I think it's important as a horse player to be mindful of the track without going overboard. And so in some ways, I see us as the eyes and ears of the public to make sure we're at least saying to people, hey, it feels like there could be a bias, or keep your eye on it. I'm not going to get talked off of 20-to-1 shots, I can tell you that. But when there's certain short-priced horses you think were logical, and suddenly you feel like the racetrack could really be playing against them, then you do want to adapt. So I think you have to take it as a situation, like everything in racing, Jeremy, is a situation-by-situation, if that makes sense, and to go from there. But I think for us, we want to keep focusing on it. But I feel like biases, honestly, are very tough to play while they're going on in some situations, but they're great for playing going forward when you get to a much more fair track, which we used to deal with. Because basically what you have are PPs that are leading the uninformed in one direction that's very wrong. They're telling people that the horse that won the Remsen ran a better race than Frosted. Well, we all know that Frosted ran the much better race. So, that's an oversimplification. And as well as Private Zone ran, we also know that his performance had a great deal to do with the racetrack. And there are horses like Transparent that, ran last and appeared to have run really lousy that have legitimate and giant excuses. And this is stuff we can use going forward because that's what creates value.
Do you ever have a situation where the track's playing a particular way and you're talking about a bias and you get any kind of pushback from management or even some of the maintenance guys of, hey, we're trying to work this out, don't emphasize that things aren't fair, that sort of deal? I've never had that in my public handicapping situation, though I've said races were bad betting races, and I've been pulled into the principal's office with management and told you're not supposed to tell people that these are terrible betting races. But in terms of evaluating a track, have you ever run into that where the track condition was ever kind of passed down to, let's lay off of that?
Absolutely not. Contrary to popular belief, the people in NYRA like what I do, and we're all on the same team together. And I happen to think that NYRA has the single greatest track super ever in Glenn Kozak. And Glenn and I are friends, and we talk a lot. I mean, listen, I give him a hard time sometimes. They'll say, what are you doing about that gold rail? But it's all in a positive manner, and no, absolutely not. There's never been any kind of pushback whatsoever when somebody says, why are you talking about that, or you shouldn't talk about it. Absolutely not.
Right.
Andy, in terms of how the public can benefit, give a feel for what you think the intermediate and probably doesn't even have to be identified as a beginner, an intermediate, or a veteran player, but what level of interaction in terms of incorporating the information should people be willing to include? I mean, if there's something that you're seeing and mentioning, what do you think people should do with that information? Do they just fold the horse into their bets somehow? Saver bets? I mean, what do you think is the right scenario for that interaction?
The last thing any of us should ever do is tell somebody else what the right thing to do is, because that's the beauty of the racetrack. It's an opportunity for everybody to decide what's right for themselves. Ideally, I hope people are listening, and if we're talking, listen, if somebody doesn't want to hear what I have to say, they should mute me or not listen, and that's fine. But ideally, they should be really interested when they disagree with me and give themselves an opportunity. And I don't say this arrogantly like me, because I do this when I talk to people like Nick Tamaro, who I think has a sensational opinion, or Mike Beer. I'm most interested. I don't need to have a conversation with Nick or Mike when we agree in every race. That doesn't help anybody, because it means we'll both be wrong a lot. And I want to listen to somebody who has a different opinion than me, and I hope that people do that in my case, and think, I don't agree with what Andy's saying. I don't agree with what Mike's saying. Why are they saying that, and why is it that I disagree with them? You know what? I think he's wrong for this reason and that reason, and I'm sticking with my opinion. You know what? I think Andy makes some sense, and I hadn't looked at that, and I'm not saying listen, nobody should ever get away from long shots they like, but I think they should incorporate them if it works for them. Mike pointed out some horses in Saratoga, like So Lonesome when the Albany, when I realized, he's making a very good point. Stonetastic when she won the Prioress. Yeah, she got a gold rail, but regardless. These are points that I thought were very well taken, so I significantly incorporated them in my play. I've also incorporated opinions of theirs that haven't helped, but that's fine. But for me, I would never incorporate. I mean, listen, I may throw in a 20-to-1 shot one of them likes I don't like at all, and a pick 3 or pick 4, just because I respect them. But in general, I'm not going to make a horse a big part of my play unless I see their logic and see that they saw something that I didn't see that I wish I had seen. And if I had seen it, I probably would have bet it myself. And I think that's what people should do when they listen to anybody. If they respect their opinion, they should respect it enough to think about what they disagree with and think maybe I shouldn't disagree or maybe I still do. And, the game is about trying to figure it out for yourself.
One thing that is coming up repeatedly, Andy, in the chat applet, and I've got to give you a chance before we go on to sound off about it and to reminisce a little bit. The number of references so far that I'm seeing about Ciro's and you and Harvey talk about that and about the evolution of your opinion in terms of your delivery and what has gone into that portion. But I think a lot of it really starts with those mornings that people treasured during Saratoga.
Well, I appreciate that, and I can tell you that I treasured them as well. I frequently thought on my walks over to Ciro's and when I was leaving that I was very lucky to be part of something that was very special. And having the opportunity to work, especially in that type of setting with somebody like Harvey Pack was one of the great joys of my life. Harvey and I are great friends, but also, Harvey is more clever and more funny than I think a lot of us even realize sometimes. And, we had a great time doing them together. And so for me, it was a great learning experience working with somebody like Harvey and having an opportunity in that informal but a little bit formal setting to sort of try to figure out where I was and try to move myself forward so that when I went to NYRA, obviously I can't be the same loose cannon I was at times at Ciro's, but you have to have a certain amount of integrity and be willing to, bring things over like the dunce cap that, we have fun with and, an opportunity to say that as smart as I think I am, I'm really, just as stupid as everybody else a lot of the time. And that's the great thing about the racetrack. It teaches us humility, or to some degree at least. But, working with Harvey, I can't really measure what it did for me. I enjoyed it more than I think I'll ever know. And those were really, really great times, the times that, Steve and Harvey and I were up there and just the things I remember him saying, him saying that, people said that Saratoga is the graveyard of favorites, and Harvey said, it's the graveyard of bad handicappers, and telling somebody on the show one day, you sound like a 900 number, and just, so many great things that Harvey did over the years. It was really some of the greatest times of my life.
Well, one of the questions as well asks about your own opinion, and we've discussed this over the years at the races in the mornings. And of course, Trips and Traps, a invaluable addition to the NYRA website offerings, a show that, while yes, it's giving people horses to make a list of that are bet fors and bet against, but more importantly, it showcases your race watching acumen and the way you look at a race. Talk about conveying your own personal comprehension of the races and how people can pick up on those nuances.
Well, I really do hope people watch Trips and Traps, and I'm very proud of it. And, Eric and I did it for many years together, and now Richard McLure is obviously doing it with me, and having Richie's perspective from a rider's standpoint, I just think it's something that people can't get anywhere else, and I really do think there's a lot to be learned from it, and I think if I could think of the one thing about the show that I've hopefully imparted to people, and listen, once again, people are always free to disagree, I have a strong philosophy on watching races in a simplistic way that sort of obvious trouble is the biggest misdirector, and for lack of a better phrase off the top of my head, for people. They see obvious trouble and they think it's significant, and it's not. That races are much more a function of how they're run and starts are the most important times of races, and the toughest trips are a horse that is way against the dynamics of a race. And the easiest trips are the opposite, when you're very much with the dynamics of the race. And people overemphasize trouble while ignoring race dynamics. And I think one of the things that I'd like to think I've had a positive effect on is bringing race dynamics more to the forefront or more to people's attention. And I'm not trying to say I'm the only person that obviously talks about it, because clearly I'm not. But I hope that that's something that people can impart from that show and our other shows, because I do believe that to understand trips of races, you need to understand how they're run and not get overly caught up in minor little steadies and checks.
We just sent out on the applet the links to Trips and Traps, not only at NYRA, but at the YouTube channel, where they're all chronicled. And once you watch it once or twice, you'll completely be addicted, and you can go to it, and it'll be a great resource for winners and for horses that you can be confident to go against when they run back. The National Racing Report as well, since we're on this topic, Andy, for those that can't watch all the weekend racing for whatever reason, and you want to get an understanding of the stakes races and how they unfolded and why, and how, for instance, looking back at the Remsen from Saturday, people will be able to understand why Frosted ran just a...
I wasn't on this week, but I'm sure Richie and Jay covered.
Yeah, those kinds of things. Those are the ways that you not only understand races, but you subliminally, I think, get the kind of skills that can only come from experience in this game.
Well, I also think, having Richie and I both on it, we disagree sometimes, and that to me is the best thing we can do. This is why I think that, and this is why Richie disagrees and thinks this. And that gives people an opportunity to see it from both sides. And maybe they have a completely different opinion, or maybe it opens it up to, different possibilities. Because clearly my assessments aren't always accurate by any stretch of the imagination. Or there's two different ways to determine it. I mean, I'll, have one thought, and Richie will say why he says, I see why you think that, but... And he makes a point that I realize, makes an enormous amount of sense. And I occasionally like to think that sometimes I make some sense to him, but I think that it's the differing opinions where we're going to all learn the most, and hopefully we do that on occasion. I mean, some things are cut and dry, but everything isn't, certainly in this game.
I'm going to spill the beans on a little industry secret here. I've worked on a lot of the national television broadcasts, from NBC to CNBC to MSNBC to every network we've been on, ESPN, over the years. There are times in production meetings where the handicappers on the air are asked to pick a different horse. So if you are watching a national TV broadcast and there are 5 handicappers and they pick 5 different horses, sometimes that's set up that way to cover the different horses in the race. I know it may not be the most honest way or the most straightforward way. You don't see that in the simulcast shows like Andy's talking about. When they disagree with each other, that's a good thing. And there are situations with the handicappers, like a Bob Newmeyer and Mike Battaglia on NBC over the years. That's not happening with those folks. They're giving their hardcore handicapping opinions. But a lot of times when they're doing the whip around and there's 6 or 7 different people handicapping, if it happens to be a race where everybody's on the same favorite, it does come up from producers. I've been there, I've heard it, where they say, does somebody else want to take another horse just so we can get somebody in on the show? So, you're not watching a national TV broadcast so many times for handicapping hints and what to bet. And a lot of times they're trying to tell the storylines of the race. But that is one way that public handicappers on the national shows may differ from what Andy's talking about on the simulcast programming.
Yeah, I would think that's fair. I mean, listen, there are times where I'm going to pick listen, I will never do anything deceptive, and I'm always very clear when I'm betting, but I could be between the 4 and 6 and sort of ready to flip a coin, and I look and I see that Jay likes the 4, so I pick the 6, not because it's just enough, and I'll say, I'm using both of them, but here's the merits of these horses. I don't want, I know people want to know your ROI and all that stuff, but the reality is you can't really have a positive ROI over a long time, and if as a public handicapper you were beating the takeout, you're doing reasonably well, and if you're cutting it in half, you're doing well. So I just don't want to get overly caught up in who you picked, who you like. We give out picks, and we give out 4 of them when there's superfectas, 3 when there's tries, because enough people want that we have to give our customers what they want. But that's not what we're really interested in. We're interested in discussing the races and trying to stimulate discussion in the races. And that, to me, is the most important thing. And if we are successful in what we're trying to do at NYRA, we're promoting a discussion of the races, even if it's one that involves completely disagreeing with us. That's just as good as agreeing. And, in fact, maybe it's better.
You know, there's a point, Andy, on the applet where the suggestion's being made that the top handicappers like an Andy Serling aren't going to lay this out for people because it would drive the price down. But in fact, it's very obvious when there's depressed prices, particularly in multi-race wagers, where it's obvious that your opinion has been co-opted by serious players and has driven the prices down.
Okay, good. That means people are betting. I mean, listen, my ego, as you well know, Steve, is way too big to ever not get full credit when I like a winner. So I'm not hiding anything. You know, it is funny that years ago, a guy at Belmont said to me, it was really funny, he came to me, he said, one of my friends was saying to me, that Serling, he's not giving out his real opinions in the air. And the guy told me, so I said to him, so let me get this straight. You figure Andy spends 3 hours at home figuring out who he really likes and 3 more hours figuring out who he's going to lie to you about? And, I laughed, and I never really thought about it that way. But, yes, I'm not spending extra time figuring out who to lie to people about. I got a big ego, and if I'm smart, I want everybody to know it. And I also don't seem to mind when I'm really stupid a lot of the time, too.
One of the things that separates you from the field is your ability to understand betting patterns based on the nuances of will pays and probables. Talk about that, Andy, and your statistics background, your time on Wall Street, and that to me, when I'm listening and I hear you go in that area, I'm always attentive.
Well, I think it sometimes depends on different races, but I do think there's a certain amount of importance to the board. It's hard because we go on the air, 10 minutes before the race, and obviously the board changes a lot. But I think it's important. Listen, the multi-race bets, some aren't huge pools, and especially when you get long shots, you're going to see aberrant payouts that are just random. But in general, I think it's important to at least impart to people, wow, this first-time starter took a ton of money in the double or the pick 3, or both. Or, geez, the pick 3, this horse is like the 5th choice, and it's co-favorite in the double. It's important to get that out there at the very least so people are aware of it. I think the more information you're giving people, we all don't have the answers as to why, but to at least give it out there so they're thinking about it. Wow, I hadn't realized that. No, that's a firster. I want to make sure, is that horse going to get bet? And I do want to listen, once again, Steve, we're just trying to get as much stuff out there as we can in a reasonably educated way. And that's why we talk about biases. And you hear people saying, why are you talking about the biases? And it's like, because it's a topic of conversation that, it appears that maybe, X. And just say, I'm not absolute about it, but maybe pay attention to this. And we're just trying to keep a conversation going and get information out to people.
Well, I do an exceptional job, and I can say here and those that know from listening to us weekly on the radio, you've taught me more than anybody about the nuances of handicapping and race dynamics, and that information you make available to all that care to listen and learn, and we appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, but I also appreciate what you guys do. I think that, I know that your show, Steve, wherever I go, people are stopping me and saying to me, I listen to you on Steve Vick every week, and they're not listening because I'm on. They're listening because you're on and the kind of quality guests you put on, and it's an invaluable resource in the game. And I say the same thing to Jeremy and what you guys are doing with Night School. All this stuff is really important stuff and great stuff, and I think that you guys should be really proud of the work you do.
Well, and I thank you, and I'm sure Jeremy and Caden and Jerry and everybody involved.
I love Caden. I mean, I remember the good old days when Caden was working at Gulfstream.
Well,
the really good old days back in the mid-'90s.
And she was talking about the evolution of her work, and she's one of those that really has that hybrid. We talked about what Maggie does and physical opinion and that contribution, and Caden's done just a little bit of each. I mean, and she's got this well-rounded approach. She's
the consummate professional, Caden Rayner, without question.
No doubt about it. And Andy Serling as well. Andy, thanks so much.
Thank you. I appreciate being on, and keep up the great work. I'll talk to you guys soon.
Andy Serling, everybody. Follow him on Twitter, of course. We just sent out his Twitter address directly. In fact, Jeremy and I did it back to back. And we also, of course, redirect you to everything that NYRA.com, the website has gotten better and better and better. And whether it's Trips and Traps, the National Racing Report, Mike Beer's written analysis is there as well. And they stream Talking Horses. It's all there. Replays, all invaluable tools to help your handicapping and wagering.